There's a poll going around where it's asking Democrats and Republicans, how do you think the economy is going right now? How do you think inflation is going? How do you think people's wages are going? How do you think jobs are going? And the majority of Democrats on these polls vote in favor of the economy is doing really well. The economy is in a good position. It's in good shape. There's not much to worry about. When I say that, there are still some Democrats who don't believe the economy is doing well, but a good majority of them believe the economy is doing well. And just to paint a perspective for a lot of people, the majority of people will follow the mainstream narrative, and the mainstream narrative aligns with the leftist or Democrat Party. That's because whenever you go to an airport, whenever you go to your break room, whenever you talk to peers, it's all information that comes from MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CNN. Most of our institutions, especially our media institutions, are controlled by the left. So there's a certain narrative. Now, the question is, why are the majority of Democrats believing that the economy is in good shape when we know, if we look at the data, the economy is not in good shape? The economy is actually on the brink of not collapsing per se, although that is a potential possibility, but on the brink of going through another downturn, similar to the great financial crisis in '08. It could potentially get worse. We have, the 1929, the Great Depression. We do have banks right now that are leveraged to a high extent. We're seeing small regional banks collapse. Some people may say it's orchestrated to roll out a centralized digital currency that the Federal Reserve would own that would have more control over the monetary system. Also, it's being used to consolidate the big banks, the big major banks. Instead of having different options that would provide consumer with choice, you now consolidate to just four major banks, and people have less of a choice, and therefore these bigger banks can form an oligopoly. It's a lot worse than that. We've seen that Congress has been spending trillions of dollars over the course of the past few years. Now, they will use crisis, whether real or fabricated, to implement more spending. So they will say X is going on. The only way to solve this is to spend more money and to take this money and partition it into certain areas of our nation so that we can forego this crisis and actually solve the problem. This is a huge misconception. It's another ploy to spend more money from the taxpayer. On top of that, to take on debt because we don't have enough money that we're collecting from tax revenue. Not really tax revenue. The IRS is not a business. They're just stealing money. But we have to take on more debt. We have to gather more money, which requires us to take on debt. And then we spend this money on unnecessary things, such as a proxy war, a conflict war, that is not serving the interests of America. But when you have enough public sentiment, you can say that there's this crisis, it's a big threat to your existence, and we need to spend more money. That's the solution. And then people are in favor of spending. Now, what happens when we spend all this money? We're adding more money into the circulation. So by that very definition, it's a very objective term, you are inflating the dollar. So now, whatever money we have, cash, liquid in our savings accounts, the dollar is worth less. Okay, that's how we got the term worthless, but it's worth less, which means, generally speaking, assets, hard assets, productive assets, those appreciate because of the nature of inflation. But if you just have liquid cash sitting somewhere or physically, so digitally or physically, that is actually losing buying power, losing purchasing power over time. Now, how the government gets control of this is they have to go to the Federal Reserve, which Jerome Powell, that is tied to the government. He's appointed by the president, but underneath him are private banks, which is separate. So that's separate from the federal government entity. And you have these private banks, these private institutions, they come together and they say, we need to shrink the money that's in circulation because over time, if we don't get control over this, we will lose our value of the dollar. And we're all relying on the dollar as the primary way of transacting for goods and services. So we have to increase interest rates. When you increase interest rates, you reduce the demand in the market in businesses because it's now more expensive to borrow capital. Capital becomes more expensive. When capital is cheap, when the interest rates are low, people spend more, people invest more, they build businesses. When capital is expensive, it shrinks and tightens not just the labor market, but the overall markets. And so that does remove money from circulation in a sense. But what it does is it causes stagnation and potentially recessions or depressions because now people, they can't have access to jobs or their wages are stagnant. And sometimes you can be in a position where inflation is still going up, but wages are staying the same. So your price of food and gasoline, basic necessities are going up 5, 10, 15%, but you're still getting the same hourly or annual salary wage. That now poses a problem. That's stagflation. So we don't want to end up in a situation like that we do have to condense and tighten, which is going to hurt the labor markets. But it's this constant cycle of bloating the markets up and then shrinking it down. So imagine if 1 month you gain 100 pounds, the next month you lose 100 pounds or 90 pounds. On paper, as a net, you lost 10 pounds or whatever it is, that small margin. But month to month, gaining 100 pounds or losing 100 pounds, that's not healthy for you. You're putting a lot of stress on your organs, a lot of stress on your body, on your joints, on your mental and physical well-being. The same concept applies to the market, to the economy. It's not just the stock market, it's the overall economy, it's jobs, it's small businesses. Now, this is good for the big guys because they can withstand all the, for the most part, depressions and financial stressors in the markets from these different time periods, but it crushes these small businesses. So these small mom and pop or even small franchises, they can't really, not to say that they're all over leveraged. I mean, banks are over leveraged to a large degree, which is why we see banks fail during hard economic times. But a lot of smaller businesses can't keep up with demand. They're running at very small margins, very small profit margins. So any little hiccup really hurts their business. Now, we could just be ideally at a 1% to 2% inflation a year. Don't spend a huge amount of money. Let the free market take care of itself. Have the Federal Reserve either exist, but very lightly intervene. I mean, you don't really need to intervene if you have 1% to 2% inflation and you're not spending money like crazy through Congress. But unfortunately, we have corrupt people at the top. And when you have people who are part of these different financial institutions, or not just financial, but political institutions, whatever institutions are at the top, and they come together, they can manipulate markets, they can manipulate economies and systems because they have an interest that would allow themselves to benefit. And they don't really care if there's collateral at the bottom. They don't really care if someone who's making 40, 50K a year now has to spend 10 or 15% more of his or her disposable income just on goods and necessities that they need month to month. The people at the top don't really care about that. They only care about themselves making an extra buck. So that poses a problem. We could have the system be as is, free market, 1% to 2% inflation a year. So you're slowly growing the pie because the population is increasing. Well, you would like the population to increase, and it would also provide a small incentive for people to spend their money or to invest their money so they don't slowly erode their money due to inflation. But it's 1% to 2%. It's not like they need to make a big decision immediately. They could wait a few years. But when you have a large amount of inflation, which is done artificially by government institutions and political interests, you're forcing the majority of people to effectively, their money is being eroded. And a lot of these people are not financially savvy, so they don't know how to invest. They don't know where to put their money. They don't know about any financial instruments. They don't know how to start businesses. They're relying on the overall status quo system of 9 to 5, employer, employee. And so they're effectively a slave, a financial slave at that point. And so we have now a system that financially enslaves people. There's different types of enslavement. There's mental enslavement as well. But this is a financial enslavement because now people don't really own their money. If their money can just be printed, and it's not, it's not necessarily bad. It is bad to print money, but if you're at 1% to 2% inflation a year, you are printing money. You don't want a scarce resource like Bitcoin to be used as currency because that's not accounting for that 1% to 2% inflation a year, which would grow the pie because you're going to have new people enter the system. If it were scarce, people could hoard the wealth, and it's not ideal for a currency. Currency needs to be inflationary by definition. You could use currency that is not inflationary by definition, but at a certain point, it's going to break because there's going to be too many people in the system, or a lot of people can take advantage of that system. Whereas if it's inflationary, and these are not perfect, but if it's inflationary, at least new people can come in, and there's an incentive to take your money and spend or invest it. The only problem is the people who control the levers of printing the money. So, and look, whether we get rid of the Federal Reserve, whether we have a deflationary or a net neutral, non-inflationary or not deflationary currency, or an inflationary currency, the major problem is holding people accountable. So the perfect system is 1% to 2% a year, have that currency, and then hold the people accountable who are printing the money, who are spending the money. Also, banks have a fractional reserve system. So they only need, let's say, for example, they only need to keep 10% of their deposits in their bank, and they can leverage out 10 times to 100 times more. So they're actually fabricating money in thin air. It's not necessarily the Congress or Federal Reserve who is creating this money out of thin air. It is quite literally all these other private institutions who, yes, they have regulation, but they work with politicians and governments to be able to create money out of thin air. Small basic examples: when you go to a bank and you get a loan, oftentimes that loan, the money for the loan, is not there. They have to create the loan out of thin air. So a lot of this money is, I don't want to say fake money, because it's how our current system works. But we need to understand that if we're not holding people accountable, well, they can inflate the dollar to 10, 15%, like even more in Zimbabwe, where they inflated their dollar so many times over that you would be a billionaire, but you need $10 billion to buy groceries, right? So your money is effectively worthless. The value of the dollar is worthless. So we have to preserve our system so that the monetary system works for everyone. If we let people at the top get away with, let's just print more money, let's just spend more money, let's just jack up interest rates, let's just lower interest rates to 0% and stimulate the economy, this is all artificial. We are doing this to ourselves. We're hurting ourselves for no good reason. Again, you have people at the top who don't really care about collateral of people at the bottom. And so if there are 300 million of us and there's only a few thousand of them, we, the people, do have the power to hold them accountable. It's not like we don't. And the more, even if it's a minority, the more that people wake up and understand the financial system, the more that they can see, okay, let's say you can't necessarily change the system, but you will work towards it. At least understand where you can invest your money, buying some hard assets, buying productive assets, some speculative assets. Of course, you need to do your due diligence, but you have to build businesses. You have to find ways to break out of the status quo system, which really wants you to take your money that you earn, save it. You know, people say save 50%, put it into a bank, and eventually somehow you're going to be rich or wealthy. That's not how this works. You have to take your money and you have to invest it. Not to say that you shouldn't have some kind of reserves, liquid, just in case something goes wrong, you lose your job, X, Y, and Z, business is not doing well for a few months. But to grow your wealth, you have to build businesses. You have to invest in other businesses. You have to do something with your wealth that is productive. You have to create more than you're consuming. You have to produce. A lot of people are not taught this in school, somewhat by design, but also inadvertently, because everyone part of the system is already brainwashed. So the more you wake up to this, the more you learn this, the more you can escape the system, in the sense of you now have financial instruments that you can utilize. But as a whole, even if you're at the top, you should understand that if you ruin, even if you're part of the chain of ruining the financial system, it's eventually going to affect you. It's eventually going to personally affect you. Right now, you feel okay with a 10% increase in your groceries because you're a multimillionaire, but at a certain point, it will affect you. Now you're just playing the race of, am I going to be dead by then? Or is it going to catch up to me? Because it can happen very soon. If this system gets out of control and there's not enough checks and balances, you could theoretically have Congress spending tens of trillions of dollars, Federal Reserve not being able to tighten labor markets or just the economy in general long enough to preserve the value of the dollar, and then people being in stagflation, high inflation with the monetary, with the dollar, and then also wages not going up, and eventually that system collapses. And you have a new civilization that breeds out of that. But we don't want this system to collapse because we don't know what the next system would look like. It may not preserve our individual rights. And so we have to understand that money rules the world, in a sense of this is how we get people to do things, build things, how we feed our families. This is very important. This is vital to our survival.